everyone. I'm Kristen Becker. I'm the founder of KB Art Strategies and a friend of the gallery. I wanted to say thank you to Timothy, Chloe, James, and the rest of the staff, and of course to Hayal and Peter for being here today. It's really an honor to be part of this dialogue. I am incredibly lucky. I've known Hayal for over 10 years. I've been able to see her practice shift and evolve in so many ways. And so when I learned that this was going to be the debut exhibition at the new space here, it was incredibly exciting to be asked to host this conversation with her and of course with Peter. And thank you to Peter for lending, not only your experience as an artist, but also someone who has known Hayal for quite some time as well. So this is meant to be pretty open and organic. Sort of given the amount of years that are up here together. So Hayal was at Yale from 2009 to 2011 when Peter served as professor and director of the MFA painting program at the Yale School of Art. And that was from 2002 to 2011. So what I wanted to start off with was to just get some foundational aspects of your practice. And maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like to apply to Yale, what that portfolio looked like at the time.
Hi. Hi, thank you for coming. That portfolio was, I was making representational work when I applied to Yale. It was very much black and white, kind of, almost looked like comic strips, and very dark in subject matter. And I was using materials that were used in actually in offices, kind of like Sharpies and highlighters and printing at really large scale. So I was interested in this idea of making a painting without materials of painting. And I don't know what you remember.
Also started wrestling with the beginning of the digital revolution.
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of my subject matter was concerned with collecting images online. So I was very much interested in accumulating dark image material. Right now we call it the dark web, but back then it wasn't the dark web, it was just what the internet was. And so I was going into the depths of, the darkest imagery that I could find and kind of taking that and making it into a more digestible visual form that looked kind of removed from its subject matter. So I was interested in the kind of the banality of evil that I had access to via the internet as a person that was living in Turkey. That it was interesting to me that all of a sudden I had access to all this information.
Mm-hmm. And Peter, was there anything about that portfolio or the first year or so of her work that stood out to you in particular, or certain references or resources that you saw?
I think one thing would be...
Oh, do you want to use the mic right there? Thanks.
Okay. Well, actually, before I answer your question, when we all sat down today, several of Hayal's former teachers and mentors and classmates are here. If I miss anybody, raise your hand, but Min Ha is here from Seoul, and Chris Martin, I believe, worked with Hayal, and Danielle Tediger. And so it's nice to see members of that community here for you. Well, it was hard to attract foreign students at Yale. And as far as I know, Hayal is the only person who came from Turkey and Istanbul to the program. And I've always been interested in what kind of, not culture shock, but what was it like arriving from abroad to study at Yale, and particularly from Istanbul?
For me, coming to the painting program was interesting because I said I was using materials that were not traditionally used for painting, and so my vivid memory was that I plopped, a gigantic iMac in my studio and sort of started, going online and printing things out. And I think that was a little bit confusing, maybe, for everybody there. But other than that, culturally, my undergrad education was very conceptually based. So I was used to coming up with ideas first and then executing them. And when I got to Yale, everybody came into my studio and they were like, you need to stop thinking and just making, just stop thinking a lot about what you're doing and just make, and then we can talk about the things that you've been making. So don't over-conceptualize things. Other than that, culturally, I'm trying to think. I just was shocked at the number of different toothpaste that one could get. but I think, in the past 10, 12 years, Turkey has kind of caught up with all of that too. But.
I know you also shared not just that, you might have been one of the sort of earlier colleagues who was sort of interested in that sort of computer aspect and the digital, but also, Peter, I know you were mentioning that some of those references also included some early animations, aspects where you could see, almost like a visual collage factor, and really kind of getting that sort of graphic sensibility down. So if you can talk a little bit about, some of the references that you maybe saw, those sort of 1930s aesthetics.
Well, yes, we were preparing for this session, and to go back for a minute, I think Hayal's thesis show at Yale laid the groundwork for her practice and the kind of space she makes that began there and continues. And we were looking at some paintings from 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and I said, Hayal, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but these really remind me of early Disney animation. And believe it or not.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on, actually. It is, I'm very much interested in that visual language, manga, anime, and also early Disney animations, which is, it's very different than computer renderings. It's basically making a painting and then making the same painting over and over again to animate it in an analog way. And so the kind of, the movement, trying to capture that feeling of movement and magic in a painting has always been of interest to me. And the work that I applied to Yale with was definitely hugely inspired by anime and manga. So I do have an interest in animation that way. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the slippage between, your approach to the internet and kind of, working in that realm, wanting to make the distinction between the handmade, right, the analog aspect like you were just mentioning, but also trying to think about it in reference to the internet and sort of your decision to want to, step away from those experiences and really immerse yourself in the studio practice, with a lot of focus there. So if you could share a little bit about like sort of where those aesthetics might come from.
Yeah, so I mean, when you have access to something, there's a kind of addictive quality to information that we've all experienced online. And so around the time that I got into Yale and, coming to the United States, getting an iPhone for the first time and, having the iMac, it was just the information started feeling like an overload and a bombardment to me, and it started giving me a lot of anxiety. And
this was like 2009 to 11. So
yes.
Just as a reminder, a reference point of what we're, the era that we're speaking of, this is also kind of like the dawn of so many people deciding to adopt these technologies, and that you were sort of already feeling that conflict.
You're right, yeah. I mean, very initially I was feeling definitely a push from it, and I did not, and I knew that I wanted to get away from relying so much on this technology, both in my daily life and as part of my practice. And so after feeling so overwhelmed, and also thinking about what it means to be experiencing art online and looking at information online. You know, all the images that we see, all the art that we see today, we initially look at it online and we see it through this feed. And I was curious what it meant in an attention economy to have an artwork kind of stand out from the rest of it, and how is it possible that an artwork stands out and others don't? And so I was thinking about kind of approaching it again very conceptually, thinking, okay, how do I make something that encourages people to slow down and look at something and spend more time with something rather than scrolling really quickly? And the conclusion that I came to was that I need to make something that is absolutely abstract and that doesn't reference anything else on the internet. And it's a very difficult task. And so the only way that I thought that I could do this was invent a set of shapes, come up with shapes that were not, circles or squares or triangles. And so while I was at Yale, I started doing some research into older language systems. And I found out this way of creating shapes by putting circles inside of squares and taking the negatives out of it. And once I started doing that, I thought, okay, I'm completely letting the computer go. I'm going to just start making these shapes by hand. I'm going to forget everything that I've made. I'm not going to reference anything. And so when I started making the shapes, it was kind of like my liberation and my freedom from the computer and just going back to making things by hand, basically. So I had to kind of reverse. I think a lot of people go into the computer to make it. I had to relearn how to make things without the computer. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that? Because one of the things I'm looking at
one of her images on Instagram.
I'm looking at an older painting as a visual reference, is not to get too academic, but I felt ever since then that the figure-ground relationships in your work are really unique. There's a figure, and then there's another figure on the figure, and is that a ground or a figure? And it's all very ambiguous and interesting. And what you were just saying about putting the circle in the square, would you continue with that? Does that have something to do with that?
Possibly, yeah, because the system itself is when you put, it's basically putting a circle in, you draw a square and then put a circle inside of it, and then you make indents into it and take the negative out of that. But so you're right, there's like a foreground, background tension there. You could actually use the foreground or the background as the shape. And you were talking about my thesis show, and the thesis show, I think there was definitely that push-pull, and I'm still very interested in that even today, kind of not knowing what is in the front and what's in the back, and playing with that. Even though these may be suggestive of landscapes in some way, there is a push-pull where, I really want the viewer to kind of question, am I looking at something that's at the front or at the back? So coming up with that shape system really did make me think about it.
And before we go on to the current work, for many years I felt there was a sort of a tension in your work between suprematism and neoplasticism and Disney. It's
a very unique place.
Are those the things you were trying to reconcile on some level?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah. How do you do that? How do you bring sort of a spiritual understanding of painting or shapes to talk about your emotions while at the same time addressing things like attention or technology, but also kind of having these pop cultural references to it, So it's, now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, it's kind of like trying to make like the ultimate pop song maybe, but that has like conceptual leanings in it.
Yeah, and I think, with these conceptual underpinnings, trying to sort out the tension, I guess, between the intuition that you're talking about, right? The sort of the sort of openness between that figure ground, but also recognizing that you've come up with a set of parameters, right? There's a certain aspect of control, there are certain rules around what you're creating. And so was that much of a open conversation during the time that you guys were sort of in the more academic framework, or was this something that you were kind of pursuing, more on your own or through readings and, referencing these sort of hieroglyphic texts and these sort of early languages?
Yeah, so when I was coming up with the shapes, I didn't necessarily think of them as a language, or I didn't even realize I was making a language. But Peter and I always had conversations in the studio about the freedom that comes from, like you said, creating certain parameters, visual parameters in the work that you make. And then when you have those visual parameters, then the whole world opens up to you creatively. Then you can make anything that you want and express anything that you want, and it all of a sudden makes sense to other people around you. Otherwise, if you don't have that visual vocabulary, then things could get lost. And so that was also one of the things that I was thinking about visual being able, like people being able to recognize the visual language that I have, and but also the freedom that it brings me, because we were talking about it the other day. It's kind of like having a set of musical notes. There's an infinite number of compositions you can make, an infinite number of songs that you can create with a limited parameter of notes. And so I always like to think of my shape system kind of like that too, like visual music in some sort of way, but it has these parameters around it.
There's also like a lot of, I think, empathy in that approach, because you are thinking about the viewer, you're thinking about the audience, you're thinking about this shared human experience, even if it does sort of go through this lens of technology and the sort of push-pull that's there. But you're really thinking about, like, how do you share that with the person who's standing in front of the work, right? Because much as I think we're all so thrilled we can see so much art, from our homes, there's nothing that compares to standing in front of these paintings. So I think that you do a very uniquely great job at kind of pulling someone in and standing next to them while they're looking, which I, just as a viewer, have appreciated for so long, even in the earlier work when it was maybe a little more acrylic, and the color palette was a little bit more on the digital side of things. But to kind of see how that vocabulary has expanded and shifted so much, especially the works in the show are just from the last year and a half at most, I think. And so I wanted to also speak a little bit about this language that you pursued for a decade. Hayal did prints and sculptural works and video and multimedia, some really amazing installations. In 2021, after 3 years, there was a project at the New York Public Library at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library, and it was 85 by 17 foot mural, which was 95 medium density fiberboard motifs. And so, we had kind of talked about that moment for you was a little bit of a closing of some of that language and opening up a new path in the studio. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to, what had been going on leading up to that, whether change of location or, change in studio approach that led to that decision.
Yeah, it was very organic, I would say. At that time that I started working on the Stavros Niarchos library install, there was a lot of production involved that took me out of the studio, that was external to me. I had to go and coordinate, things that needed to be made, or engineers, this and that. And so that gave me a lot of freedom in the studio. And I'd moved to Los Angeles, and I've always been a meditator. I like meditating. And moving to LA kind of, I got a little bit more into that world of, meditating and kind of exploring my more spiritual side, I would say. And I don't know if it was related to LA, but LA is certainly more conducive to that kind of exploration. And what I thought I wanted to do was, I'm benefiting so much from this in my personal life, kind of like being in the present moment. and being intuitive. I really want to bring that back into the studio. And so instead of, I thought, okay, I'm not going to try and create information or data from these shapes. I'm just going to kind of sit here and, let the shapes dictate the painting that I should be making. So it led me to a more intuitive process. And then at that point, I also was, kind of really thinking about sustainability in my studio. So I wanted to stop using plastic-based paints. So I thought, okay, how am I going to bring that into it? That's when I started using the oil sticks and pigments. And so it was a very organic process. And then the pandemic happened, and then I had to move out of my studio into our backyard. And that was kind of like, okay, I knew I was inspired by the natural world, but it was kind of just painting outdoors kind of really pushed me even further and brought the browns and then the dark reds and the clay colors into my palette. It took a minute to let go of the grays and the blacks and the whites that that were so prevalent.
Hayal, going back perhaps 5 or 10 years, my chronology isn't so clear, but there's such a temptation to concentrate on the shape language of your paintings, but your color is really distinctive and certainly your own. And as I flipped through all your paintings, the palette's distinctive, but I can't quite conceptualize the elements. Do you, how do you think about the color?
That's a good question. I want to ask you the same question, actually. How do I think about it?
Well, I noticed there's a light purple or lavender in almost all these paintings.
I do love it. It's a very, it's just emotional. I don't have, I can't describe it logically, unfortunately. It's just,
Do they have emotion? Does like the lavender have an emotional association? Is it a character? Is it like a happy color, sad color?
Oh, sad colors. No, I don't think about sad colors. I don't think of that kind of emotion. It's more like the process that I make them is, I paint en plein air, and then I come back into the studio, but then I'm always kind of listening to, Japanese, kind of like classical music, or so there's a lot of feeling in the music that I listen to that I'm trying to evoke in the paintings, I think. But it's a feeling of elation, I guess. I don't know. Sometimes it's more moody. I mean, I wish I had I don't have a specific answer. I know certain color combinations that I love. I love like a brown and a lavender together. I love brown and pink together.
Another thing I noticed, not to dwell on the technical side, but in some of the older paintings and the paintings here, often you use white or very light color to make things pop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I use white as a color. So it's.
But usually it comes forward. And
it does, yeah, and the way that works for me is the paintings are on linen, so it's a darker colored canvas. So it's not. I'm not painting on white, so I can always think about and conceptualize white as a color after the fact.
Does it feel any different as you're using the oil sticks? I know some of the work that you were doing in LA had a little bit of like a gritty kind of surface to it, but a lot of the works in the show, actually, you're using a lot of like, finger and hand, and so like body heat. There's a lot of like your physical choreography, which I always appreciate, when you actually get a chance to see in person, just sort of the visual of what it is to imagine you like amongst these really quite large canvases. Does it feel any different, kind of like going through it, through that kind of process that, sort of involves your body in a slightly different way than before?
Yeah, I've always wanted to make large-scale paintings. I like the relationship to my body, like you were saying. It's again one of the things that getting up in front of from a computer, and using my body, being physically present in the world. These are really important things to me, and things that I like also the viewer to experience while they're looking at the work. And just starting to use my fingers was only kind of like a natural extension of that. It's kind of like, it really allowed me to have this very primal connection between my mind, my feelings, kind of like my gut, to my fingers, and to be able to paint in that way, even making the little sketches. So these are things that I really think about. I think about them also in terms of, there's larger questions we're thinking about these days about what it means to be an artist in the, in the age of artificial intelligence, for example. What is it to have a human consciousness rather than an artificial consciousness, and what are the differences between these two? And so for me, it's lately in the past 5 or 6 years, it's been really important to focus on things that I think that from my reading and things that I've been observing that are uniquely human in the human consciousness. Things like being intuitive, or relying on your dreams, or experiencing the world somatically, with haptic experiences, because it's the human experience, the human consciousness is not only about just kind of like calculating information. We experience the world through our bodies, and we experience the world through our hands and fingers. And so by me physically doing that every day in the studio, I hope to kind of bring that forward in my work, and for the people that are also viewing it, and to kind of bring that into the conversation. What does it mean to be physically experiencing the world and making things physically for ourselves as humans?
And I think it speaks a little bit to Peter's comment on your unique color palette as well. And then to also, I think you had said something a few days ago where it was also just the physical act of picking up a palette versus using your own hand, right? That's like, it's a mediated object you have to go through in order to do something, whereas like when it's just your body and the paint, there's something that has like a really kind of amazing immediacy, which I think is really palpable in the work. I think it adds to that immersion, but it also adds to the sort of strangeness of the combinations. There's something that's really familiar and something that's really seductive and beautiful, but also like a little hint of chaos in some of the corners that I don't think could be mimicked, outside of just your experience. So I think it's actually quite visible to people. And then I was also just wondering, for people who are coming to see the show, I know we've also talked a bit about climate and sustainability and these sort of larger issues. These are sort of theoretical landscapes to a degree, but also learning about the changes that you've made in your studio on like some logistical fronts as a way of acknowledging kind of, how you want to be moving forward. How do you see some of those bigger
just to
topics?
put that in context, I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but you moved to Vermont 2 years ago?
Yeah.
And this body of work, I think you expressed, reflects that change of environment.
Yeah, definitely. Moving to Los Angeles initially, and then moving to Vermont, kind of for somebody who's lived in really big cities all their life, to kind of, my first natural encounter was moving to LA and kind of having this yard and palm trees and, like seeing a skunk or a coyote or something, and then going hiking. I mean, I'd never, I grew up in Istanbul, it's like, 30 million people, and then moving here, and then, to have access to that, and then, like you said, moving to Vermont, it's just a whole other spectrum of relationship with the natural world, because, every day, I leave the house and then there's like a huge mountain and like trees, and we go on a hike and there's waterfalls. I mean, it's the kind of life that I'd never lived before. And so it's absolutely inspiring.
You know what strikes me is, I think your previous paintings were pretty much vertical planes, and that these tilt back as a landscape.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that how you think of it as well?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. I did, when I started making the more intuitive, shapes, they were still kind of floating in this netherworld, and I did want to bring them closer to mimicking an environment that is parallel to the world that we live in, if only to, promote this idea of biodiversity and living in harmony with other beings.
There's also one of the pieces, I think it says like between two worlds or something, is one, a veil between two worlds. And I do think that there is a lot of like world building that's happening in this exhibition. Can you talk a little bit about sort of like where that imagination goes, or where those realities exist for you, or how you want to connect with people who are seeing these paintings for the first time?
Yeah, it's again kind of probably my interest in fantasy and making up worlds. I've always had that since I was a kid. I wanted, I am interested in world building, and even world building from scratch. I think my idea of creating shapes and then having them turn into a language, and then kind of, for me now, that language has evolved into creating organic forms of its own. So I kind of almost think of it as like blocks of atoms, and then they were DNA, and now like organic shapes are coming out of it. So it's building a world of its own, but that is also based off of the reality that we live in. Kind of maybe like an idealized version.
To try to be a little bit provocative, I'm channeling two artists as I look around. I'm thinking of George O'Keeffe and Charles Birchfield. This sort of intensified vision of nature.
Yeah, beautiful. I think, oddly, that's how I see it. I mean, that's how I experience it. When I see flowers in our garden, that's how I experience them. They're very vivid, and they're very, they dance, and you were asking me about colors, it's kind of like, and people have asked me, is this like, do you see the world like I've seen it on mushrooms or something like that? And, I don't know. I don't know how they see it, but I'm kind of like a little like toddler, like walking around, oh my God, like a tiny little thing, just kind of intense focus, and I want to capture that moment. Yeah. There's an intensity. Yeah, it's like a more vivid interpretation. And there's a filter there, definitely. That's mine, for sure.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the works on paper that are in the show, and how that part of your process, that studio process of doing the drawings, like sort of where that comes in with the sort of plein air experience, and then working on the canvases?
Yeah, so the drawings are in the back, in that room over there, and so like I was saying, something just catches my eye, and I feel compelled to draw it, capture it, and I have my drawing pad, I have my oil pastels, and then I make a plein air sketch. But like Peter was saying, I think I just experience the colors more vividly and very differently. And even when I'm making the sketches, I don't necessarily, my goal isn't to make an exact replica of what I'm seeing. My goal is to add kind of like an interpretation of a sensual and a feeling that I'm experiencing at that moment too. So, I might use blue colors instead of soil, instead of the browns of soil or something, but those are like very conscious decisions to kind of emulate the feeling that I'm feeling at that moment. And then when I come back into the studio, there's another process in which I try and replace some of the shapes that I've drawn with my own image vocabulary. So there's like a constant translation of reality into what I would like it to be, or what I see it as.
Yeah, when you go through the show, when someone's a bit informed with some of your previous work, you start to recognize friends in these compositions, and they might be in sort of an amorphous stage, or they might be transitioning from one shape to another, but those sort of initial forms are like, a little bit of a wink and a nod. But I do think that, your ability to express the sensation as opposed to it being the sort of literal translation definitely gives a lot of, I would say, vocabulary to like the sort of musical or a synesthetic experience, or something where, you are kind of having a bit more like lyricism. And also, I always think it's really important in all these artist talks, everyone, all these choices are so serious, but there's like a lot of play too in this exhibition. There's like a lot of joy. I wish contemporary art kind of talked about that a little more than we tend to. Everything kind of tends to have, so much formal quality around it, but I can see that you're enjoying this phase, and also just the scale of the paintings. They feel like something to surmount but be part of as well. So it's just really exciting to kind of see where that direction is going.
Thank you. Yeah, play is very important. I'm going to go back to like the artificial intelligence conversation, but there's a theory when artificial intelligence takes over every kind of task that humans do, then all we have left to do is play. And there's and I mean, in a utopian world.
Sure.
So I think the situation is actually, we're really interested in this idea, and the term for this is Homo ludens, which means instead of Homo sapiens, ludens is play, Homo play. Like we're going to become animals and beings that just play. I mean, if this is the ideal world that we could create, hopefully. But yeah, so play is creativity, and it's a very important concept to actually hold on to still, and not to kind of over-rationalize things, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Is that part of the future direction of the studio that you feel like is something that you're sort of compelled to hold on to, or these areas that you're interested in like continuing to pursue? Or?
Yeah. I mean, also as individuals, I mean, I think the best work, no matter what work you do or best pursuit that you have, everything, it comes out best when you're enjoying what you're doing. And if you're not enjoying it, it just becomes tedious. And if there's no joy in what you're doing, then everybody else can tell that there's no joy in it, I think. And it translates into the work. Even if you're making things about heavier subject matter, I think there should absolutely be joy and play in whatever you're pursuing.
Peter, did you have any other questions for Hayal, or?
Well, it's a kind of silly question, but one almost recognizes elements of the landscape. Presumably, I see a flower or some shooting stars. And is there a one-to-one relationship between the visual, the form in the world, and the forms you're making? Or what degree of transformation is there?
Yeah, I definitely like there to be a reference. Not a one-on-one representation, but kind of, you see something and you're like, is it this or is it not that? Kind of questioning like you're doing.
Well, over there, I was wondering if that was water.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, I think we can all appreciate that there is a lot for each viewer to experience as they go through the show. There's so much that you're giving to us, through this exhibition, and I think there's a real warmth and empathy, like I said before, where as you're going through, there are some recognizable elements, but these are all worlds of yours that I think we all feel really privileged to get to experience here in the gallery. And just wanted to say congratulations again on a really fantastic exhibition, and thank you, Peter, for joining us to chat for a little bit. And thanks to the gallery. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Are there any questions?
questions? I can do questions.
Did anyone have questions?
Sure, I can do questions.
Did anyone have questions? Sure. Hold on.
I love hearing how you.
Here, I'm going to give you this.
I like hearing how you are listening to classical music. The names of the paintings are so beautiful and musical also. So I wonder if while you're painting, the name comes to you.
The titles of the work come much later. So I finished the paintings initially, but I have a ongoing list. I read a lot of poetry, fiction, fantasy, mythology. So I always make notes of things that I think could be titles. Some of them also are from music. I started keeping this list actually when I first started using Twitter, and that was in 2009, I think, and it was asking this, the question was, what are you doing right now? And then I was like, I didn't have a cell phone or an iPhone, and I was sitting in front of a computer, and I thought, this is so stupid. You know, I'm sitting in front of a stupid computer. You know, what are you asking me? And so I thought I'd start keeping a list of imaginary things that could actually been happening, that I would have preferred to have happened instead of being sitting in front of a computer. And so it's been an ongoing project for me. I have, you know, I've published books about it, and so I have this ongoing list of fantasies and things that could be happening or things that I imagine happening. And so after a body of work is done, I'll go back and kind of look and see, oh, I think this could be what this circumstance is.
So Hayal, you talked a little bit about how you have emotions when you're using the colors or choosing the colors that you use to paint. And it's not necessarily that you're happy or sad, but I wonder if that's sort of like a sense of synesthesia. Like, are you thinking about music? Are you thinking about a physical feeling? And how do those colors sort of interact in that world for you?
Possibly. I mean, the only way that I can describe it is kind of zoning out. I don't know, like my eyes are kind of, it's a weird sensation. I don't know how to describe it. It's just kind of, you know, and I know what color I want to go next to the other color. And I know at this point, because I've been doing it for so long, what kind of feelings I feel when I look at certain colors. So I know that I love like this brown and that navy and that lighter. I just know that I have a particular feeling when I paint those. And so it's just a decision of, do I want it to be a little bit more moody, or do I want it to be a little bit more joyful? It's not very conscious though. I can't really say that, you know, I'm making conscious choices. It might be synesthesia. I've always wanted to make music. I wish I could, but you know, I've become a painter instead.
You mentioned that you kind of stopped using shapes or triangles and circles, squares. So like, do you name the shapes that you come up with now? Like, do you have like a book of like shapes you just like go back to them?
I do. There's 31 shapes, and 31. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And when I finally edited the 31, I felt incredible relief at having kind of come up with this system. And I called it, it felt like, I was like, this is like paradise, but it was like, oh, it's instant paradise for me. And then I never have to think about shapes or, you know, making a form again. I can just combine and recombine these shapes that I have. So I titled it back in the day, Instant Paradise, and then there's 31 of them. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to the artists and to the gallery.